Welcome to the 39th episode of the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. Today, we'll be speaking with Mike Bergin and Amy Seeley, both of whom have worked in the college admissions industry for a very long time. I think between the two of them, we're talking about 50 plus years of experience. Mike is the president of Chariot Learning, and Amy is the president of Seeley Test Pros, LLC. They're also the hosts of Tests and the Rest, the college admissions industry podcast, which has a wealth of information for anyone interested in learning more about college admissions. I was actually just a guest on their podcast recently. They are also launching the National Test Prep Association, which is a professional group designed to support tutors and admissions advisors across the country. So these are two both very experienced and very busy people. Thank you both for taking the time to talk today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
Yeah, so, the goal of this podcast, as I told you, is a little bit different than yours. I'm going a little more broad. You focus very much on admissions, and that's really what we're going to talk about. But I also do want to branch out into the broader views of what we're doing in education in the United States and what might be better in order to better understand both what you do, but also your biases for or against in whichever other directions we end up going. If you don't mind, maybe just take a minute and talk a little bit about what you do professionally and your own education. What kind of student were you? Where did you go to school? What did you study? That way, that'll help listeners to connect the dots a little bit when we get to some of our goals or ideas later on.
So I was a secondary education major with a concentration in history. So the intention actually was to be a history teacher or a social studies high school teacher. However, I always tell people that my experience in student teaching did not leave me with a great, good taste in my mouth about wanting to be a, daily high school teacher. So I fell into test prep just thereafter. So basically graduated from college, John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio, and got an opportunity to work for the Princeton Review right out of college. And so started doing some tutoring, but in the private sector. So my entire career has been within education, however, on the privatized side. So working for Princeton, then a local learning center, and then starting Seeley Test Pros about 14 years ago. Always in education, but never having to be in the trenches, if you will, of our local high schools.
Well, and I would say, you're in it's a different trench, but it is still the same. It's similar space, right? You're still
the same war? Is that
right?
Different trench?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that depends on who we ask. Which side of this battlefield are we standing on? I don't know. Just before we get Mike's intro, I'm curious, what kind of formal training did you get from Princeton Review or along, like, Has your role in college admissions been something you've sort of learned as you've gone? Or was there a formal piece of this between your teaching degree and then your actual job as a tutor?
So interestingly, when Princeton hired me, I interviewed for the position with the idea that I would be a natural, like at that time, reading or verbal instructor. And of course, what did they say to me? Well, we want you to do math. So, there was definitely a training period. And I will tell you that I always say, the hardest things you ever do are the most rewarding. And honestly, I go back to, it was hard. It was hard, learning to do the math and to be the math teacher, even for SATs or ACTs, did not come as easily to me. But I actually think on the other side of that, it made me very good at what I do, because to understand challenge and difficulty and to work through it has certainly helped me empathize with my students over the years. So there was definitely training of tests, because I would never have pretended to be like, I know anything about the SAT or ACT, but for having taken it to go to college. But really, honestly, I'm sure Mike will say this too, you learn just so much. Most of the knowledge I have, especially about the college admissions process, initially was just learning from my students, learning from the parents. I am the mother of 5 children. So I will tell you, 3 of whom have gone through this process. 2 actually work for me now. But the basic idea is that, so much of what you learn is experiential. Especially when you've been in the business as long as like Mike and I have. This is my 27th year of doing test preparation. So every time they change a test, it's like, this ain't my first rodeo. Like you pick up and you learn and you move on to the next test.
So there's no panic now. I remember, when I was teaching a college prep, an SAT prep class in public school, like it was the College Board program that schools can buy. And I was teaching a class and they had just changed it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know anything.
2015, 2014, 2015.
It was the change before that, I think.
Oh, 2005.
Yeah. So
that was a massive revision.
Yeah. And they gave me that class and I'm like, I know what I'm doing. Then I'm like, oh wait, the test is different. I have no idea what I'm doing.
What's funny is I started in 94 when they had, I think, just changed the test. So it was like, when you're around for a few iterations, you stop being panicked about a change.
Right.
Like, oh, we'll figure this out. And you do, because your experience has taught you how to be able to be adapted, whatever changes are made.
Yeah, it's whether I'm running the Spartan race or the Tough Mudder, in the end, I know it's running with obstacles. I'll sort it out,
Right.
So, Mike, your experience, both your own education and then sort of how you got into the admissions industry.
So my path was very similar to Amy's in that I went to college. I was a psychology major. I went to SUNY Stony Brook, so State University of New York at Stony Brook on Long Island. I'm born and raised in the Bronx. And I always imagined that I would become a psychologist of some sort. And when I graduated with a psychology degree, I realized that that's impossible, that a bachelor's in psychology doesn't take you anywhere. So, I explored a lot of other options, including, I think my first taste of education, apart from tutoring, was I worked in the New York City Board of Education as a drug counselor. I was in the school system there. And then eventually, like so many people who are overeducated and undermotivated, I fell into test prep. I was a natural. I was great at tests and test prep. I had a buddy, I was living in California at the time. I had a buddy who was working for Kaplan in Boston. He said, Mike, you really should do this. It's right up your alley. And my experience there was similar to Amy's start at Princeton Review in that the training was superficial, but so it required a lot from me, and that I came in and I went through the process and I had a little bit of training and said, okay, would like you to teach a GMAT class. And basically I was preparing that class ahead of lessons and I was teaching all the sections. And then after doing all of the work to really train up so that my students didn't feel like they were my first students ever, I was done with it. And I had done the hard work of preparing the full curriculum for the GMAT class. So I said, great, I'm done. I'm ready for another GMAT class. And they said, well, we don't really have one for you. But we do have, I was in Boston at this point, and they said, well, we do have a GRE class at the University of Dover in New Hampshire. Why don't you do that? So I was like, I got to prep GRE. And so, within a couple of months, I was teaching SAT, PSAT, GRE, GMAT. Eventually, I gave up on Boston in the midst of a brutal winter, moved back to my native Bronx and started working for Kaplan there in Westchester, worked my way up to become a director for a bunch of counties in New York State, and then Huntington Learning Center recruited me for something completely different. They brought me in as director of exam prep, so I would create their programs. I would create their SAT program. Eventually, I had to create their ACT program, which was another learning curve for a test that I had never done before. Then I did SSAT and ISEE or IC. And then eventually I moved to Rochester and I started Chariot Learning. So over the course of, like Amy, 26, 27 years, I've had to do everything in test prep. I still teach, I still tutor, and I keep learning different aspects of the industry. And at every step, I feel I'm still learning more all the time. I think in our prior conversation, Ryan, you discussed how, you felt like test prep is always test prep, but admissions admissions essay development, that changes all the time. I feel like test prep is changing constantly, and what we're learning and how to teach somebody how to read effectively or a more elegant way to explain how to use a colon, just these challenges come up daily and they're fascinating.
That's true. And that's probably a fair point, especially as the tests are changing or as you have students with more diverse skill sets or experiences and trying to still prepare, even though the test is standard, the test takers certainly are not, and so you do have to tailor it to them. You said something in there that maybe we're all in the same boat. You said, I was good at tests. I was a great test taker. And so it just seemed like a natural fit. And I was actually just talking about this with a student who I tutor, I think 2 days ago. She's very, very bright. She's got a very high GPA. She's going to another test prep thing. And then the parents hired me to do more test prep. And I'm like, well, if you got the money and the motivation, that's fine. But, I probably waste 3 minutes out of every hour we work just commiserating with her over the suffering of, that many hours of test prep each week. But something that I had said to her, when you're good at tests, sometimes you don't know why. And so I think about like growing up, taking the whatever, the Iowa test and the Stanford, all the like the standard achievement tests and the benchmark tests that they do, I was always very, very high, like 97, 98, 99 percentile. And then I got to the SAT and I was like, oh, well, that's just whatever. It's a test. And so I had like this sort of, unearned bravado, I guess. And I did very little prep and I did okay. I mean, I scored well above average, but I did not do nearly as well in the SAT as I had done on all the other tests because I hadn't done the prep. When I was finishing undergrad, I took the GRE, but I did some practice tests. I read a book and the score jumped back up again. I'm like, okay, all right, I am that guy. And so something that I wonder is when you're working with students, maybe think lower achieving or even sort of average students, if you have the experience of being good at tests, how much harder or easier is it to help that student? Like I always think, this is a random reference, but this is what I'm talking about. Randy Moss, the NFL wide receiver, if you ever look at any interviews with his coaches, they always say like they spend the first couple weeks trying to tell him how to do it the right way. And he just does it his way and is better than everyone else on the field. And so in the end, Randy Moss just does Randy Moss and it's great. If you're a great test taker, I think that in some ways maybe it's harder, at least when you're starting tutoring, to help the students where it doesn't come naturally to them. Like, what are your experiences trying to translate your own skills with tests to people who don't have that?
You bring up a really good question, which is, can you be a naturally good test taker? Can you be a naturally bad test taker? Because many people approach it from the other end. And I thought you were going to say that your student has great grades, but she identifies as a terrible test taker. And that's holding her back so I won't speak for Amy or other people who are naturally good test takers. But I know that naturally good test takers, when I'm saying like untrained, just are you naturally good at tests or not? There's certain elements involved. You probably read a lot, right? If you were a lifelong reader, then you have a foundation of skills and comprehension strategies to draw on that will carry you through so much that it's difficult to fix on the back end. If you come in with it on the front end, that is an advantage. I think that if you are an inquisitive, active learner, then you probably have a broad enough experience in a bunch of different areas that you don't really feel intimidated by anything in particular. I find for myself, the fact that I am lazy at math helped in that when I would take a test, a state test, I didn't have anything to prove. I didn't have to try to overpower or brute force my solutions. My goal was to just be done with it quickly. So I would intuitively look for the most efficient path to the right answer and then move on. Amy, does any of this resonate with you?
So it's funny because I never considered myself to be a good test taker. I mean, I don't think back in our day, right? I mean, that wasn't really a conscientious thought. Like I think everyone likes to say that today. My first outing with the SAT in high school was very average. Now, I took it again and with zero prep did remarkably better. So I'm always that person of like, yes, some people can have a bad day the first time. But like I said, I think earlier, I mean, part of the way I've always approached it, and this is where you said, Ryan, about there's some students who have a little bit of arrogance, a little hubris about how they perform. I tend to always come to the test with a little bit of more like humility or respect or sort of like easing into it. And I think that helps to be kind of more cautious or conscientious about what you do or how much you need to do to prepare. But like, as Mike said, I mean, certainly the more you read, the more you expose yourself, a lot of these tests really do reward students who have become lifelong readers. And that's not something in test prep you can make up for in a really, really short period of time because, some things is just about breadth of exposure. And we get that when we read a lot.
To your original question, Ryan, what makes a person struggle at tests can often be individual, right? Some students struggle at tests because, as Amy said, they don't have that base. They weren't readers. Sometimes they struggle just because they're not familiar with the test. Sometimes they struggle because of confidence or because of specific content areas they need help in. Experience really helps understand that what you bring to the process isn't as important as what you have learned over time works for individual students. Randy Moss's coaches, not a single one of them were ever half as good as Randy Moss. That doesn't mean they couldn't be in a position to coach somebody to be effective at any position, even if they hadn't done that position themselves. It's trying to understand systemically what makes somebody good, not I'm good at it, and so I can actually impart my ability. One of the big traps in test prep is looking for a teacher based on how well that teacher did on a test and where that teacher went to school. Teacher can't magically confer her ability to get a perfect score and get into Harvard. You have to learn how to do that. That's education, and that's totally different than doing it yourself.
Well, or you're breaking things down. I mean, a lot of what test prep is, at least I think if you're a good test prep tutor, is you're evaluating or surmising your student and determining, what are the things they're doing that they need to change, alter behavior, like what's working, what's not working, and not reducing it to it's all just smoke and mirrors, tips and techniques. I mean, sometimes it's the hard work of like, you don't know punctuation rules, you don't know geometry formulas. But I think with, if you're intuitively a good test taker, if you can if you can be able to break that down for another person, then and impart that in sort of a piece by piece nature, then you can impart it. But if someone looks at being a good test taker as just being a holistic package, that it is what it is, you're going to have a hard time being able to impart that or help another student to get better at what they're doing.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the way you both actually just said the last two comments is sort of what I was getting at, because just to stick with the random football metaphor, I'm now slightly regretting bringing it up, but
now you guys are talking like way above my head now with your football.
But I just thinking like, a lot of the best coaches are guys who played but weren't great players. They played in college, then they stopped, or they were backup quarterbacks, because the backup quarterback is standing next to the coach with a clipboard. They're watching, they're hearing all the calls, they do all this, but they themselves weren't great at it, but they learn how it works. And so that's something where, like, say, that great athlete, that, Randy Moss, or that great test taker, the guy who gets the 1600 and goes to Yale and then says, hey, I can help you with the test. I'm not sure if you can, because you don't really know how it worked.
Right. Randy Moss would make a terrible coach.
Yeah. I'd love to hang out with him, but I don't think I'd want him as my coach. But it's also because that person just says, well, just do it. And you're like, but I don't know how to do it. I need the help in learning how to do it.
The mechanics sometimes. Right. How does that break down? Exactly.
And when you're the person who is just sort of good at it, and I don't want to say like naturally, but you learned it more naturally. You learned it without ever sitting down and saying, I really got to, drill this test and do whatever. It's probably harder for that person to convey how to take the test and how to prepare, because they haven't been through it. They didn't have to learn it that way. It came to them more naturally. So as we're thinking about preparation, some of this is student dependent. As you both pointed out, you have to understand the student you're working with and their needs, and I think it was, I don't remember, I think it was like Dostoevsky or something. I'm going to quote an author that I probably haven't even read, but I think the line is something like, all happy families are sad.
No, I think it's that
families are sad in their own way or something like that.
It's definitely a Russian author, I think.
Yeah. And your sentiment is correct. It's like,
every good test taker is the same, but every bad test taker is bad in their own
way.
and that's our job to like figure that out. Like, okay, what do we do for you? When you show up and you're already the kid that's good, hey, we just polish a couple details and run you through some practice tests, and there's less to be done. I mean, I'm not saying you don't do the work, but
it's funny, Ryan. Great test takers often put in even more work than average test takers.
They do.
Let's go back to our football analogy. I won't just say yours because I love football too. All right. A professional athlete spends way more time on his or her game than anybody at any level below, and does way more coaching, way more detailed practice. So Amy can attest, when you're working with a student aiming for a perfect score, you can expect that student to take way more practice tests than a student at any other level. They put the work in, even if they're focusing on just executing very specific aspects of the test a little bit better.
Well, and part of that, I think, is the self-selected nature of what we're doing, that the student or the parent chose for that kid to do the tutoring. Like in my English class, no one chose. I mean, the AP kid chose to take AP, but they were going to take an English class anyway. You're there because the law made you be there.
That's right.
And so in the classroom, I have to sort of jump that hurdle. But in tutoring, you're here because you want to be, or because your parents want you to be, and you're at least going to pretend to be enthusiastic because, otherwise who knows what you're here when you go home. So yeah, I think the kid who shows up to the tutoring and the prep is maybe in mindset different than the person who just sort of said.
And that's why when I said earlier about landing in private education, for me, oh, wow. That's what I love about it, right? Is that there's a choice to what the student's doing, Now, it's not always 100% their choice, but the idea is there is some choice. There is a goal, right? There's an intention, and you kind of, for a short period of time, you get to help that person along that path. And I think that's the one thing I love about the job that we do is it's results oriented. And I'm not saying that regular education teachers aren't results oriented, but for us, it's very quantitative, but it's also a very short period of time. We get results in a short period of time. And then we say, go on and do what you're going to do. You know what I mean? Like actually one of my friends who's a test prep tutor always says like, go on, you're healed, right? Go with God because I've done my job for you.
Yeah. It's all about immediate gratification.
Yeah. I washed my hands of you. I'm done. So, and I think you referenced this, Amy, I think you referenced this maybe a minute ago, is that it's not just tricks and smoke and mirrors. We have to do some skills. And Mike, I think you referenced the punctuation, and you got to figure out how to use the colon because you're going to get that question. To what extent do you think skills versus strategy is important? And I ask this with this background that an admission or a test prep tutor who I don't know personally, but I sort of know through online forums, I've seen her make the same comment a couple times. So I know she believes it strongly. And the second time I really started to think about this, she said, that these standardized tests are bad measures when I can guarantee that I will raise a kid's score 50 to 100 points in 2 to 4 weeks. Like she basically says, you give me a kid who's only taken the test once, and you give me whatever 2-4, I forget what her number was, 2-4 weeks. Uh-huh. She said, I can raise the score 50 to 100 points for every kid. And I'm sure there's some exceptions to that. But I also thought that's interesting. She said, if the test was really a great measure of what the kid has learned throughout, not that you couldn't raise the score, but it would be a lot harder to do it.
Well, hold on, Ryan. We'll leave the person who's making inflated claims out of it, just in case we know her, and we don't want to insult her.
Yeah, I won't know the name.
But why are you presenting the SAT and ACT as tests that test learning, what kids have learned throughout? They're not at all tests of that.
Well, no, it's a skills test, but you had to learn those skills.
But what skills are being tested? Effective written English, problem solving, and reading. And those are core transfer skills. And so you don't have to spend 2 weeks on American history, U.S. history, and then 2 weeks on world history, and then 2 weeks on algebra 2, 2 weeks on geometry proofs. No matter what a student's schooling has been, there's an expectation that when a student gets to college, there's a basket of reading, writing, problem-solving quantitative skills that they have. That's a much smaller ask to work on, and they're so carefully calibrated because, ACT has been in business for 60 years now, and College Board, 100.
Yeah, almost 100,
These tests are well known. We know what they're testing, and they've been testing a lot of the same skills throughout. So what I imagine, I won't make any inflated claims. I won't say, give me a student for 4 weeks, I'm going to raise their score by 100 points. Hopefully I raise it much more. But I'm not taking the test for the student. But I will say that given the time and the space, I could teach a student how to read better than she's reading right now. And I could teach a student to craft a better sentence and understand the fundamentals of written English in a way that her English teachers in school don't emphasize. And I can show them other things that bring what they already know to the fore or surface skills that haven't been tested in school.
And these are the benefits of working in that sort of one-on-one setting. And when you have the test, is there's a clearly defined sort of test at the end of this. This isn't just broadly improving your writing, though of course that might be part of it. But we do have sort of clear targets. We know the kinds of things that are on the test. We can work one-on-one so we can target that student's needs. And so my question with that sort of the follow-up of the second half of that is, in a quote-unquote perfect situation, and whether, I don't know how long you guys typically would work with a student, if that's 6 weeks or, 12 weeks or, how long your sessions go. What's the ratio of test taking strategy to the skills piece? Because I know when I have more time, I go all skills, and then we just start doing test taking strategies as we get closer to the test. When I have less time, when a parent contacts me and they say, you have 2 weeks, I'm like, okay, well, here's some tricks on how we do the test better.
Well,
and here's some punctuation rules. What's that ratio?
Right. That if time is limited, then you're limited on what you can do. If time is unlimited, you can take a different approach. We've been having this conversation this week among a bunch of our colleagues about this exact question. And we kind of came up with an idea. If a student comes in at a certain level, strategy may be what they need to get the bare minimum. If a student comes in the big part of the bell curve, then you're really well served with content because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. You can probably teach them or reteach them a lot of the math that they need and teach them those grammar skills that are not often taught or reinforced on the high school level. And then once a student reaches a certain level, there's minimal content review that they need, but lots of coaching and practice. Right, Amy?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I always tell parents, if we do a really good job for your student and they're really pleased, that's wonderful. But if we did it in a really short period of time, I actually will say to them, actually, I'd rather you not promote the few hours that we work with your son or daughter, because that doesn't work for everybody, right? Like, so for example, it depends what your issues are. So like one example that I always love, like for ACT English is, we teach a strategy of KISS, keep it short and sweet, right? The idea of efficiency of expression, economizing with language. And so you could have a student that comes to you, and there was a student just this past year, it was like, oh my gosh, 23 ACT English, and we're going through everything he got wrong in a prior test, and he's picking the long, wordy answers, like every single one of them. And after that session, it was like miraculous. The kid got a 35 on the ACT. And we actually pretty much achieved that at about one session. So they could go out and promote Seeley Test Pros did this phenomenal job. But if that next student comes to me and they're not picking the wordy answers, I can't give them that same return. I'm going to have to look at something else. And maybe what they're missing are a lot of random things like diction, like do you pick, issued versus accrued? And that's not going to help you beyond that one question. So sometimes we look like the rock stars, right, Mike, where we just magically wave our wand and it's like you're healed. And other times it's a really more kind of laborious process of extracting and identifying things that are going to be beneficial. And again, some of those things are skills. And then some of those are like, dude, do you realize every time you don't pay attention to what the question asks for, And
read the question.
Read the question. And of course, that's something I would say, some kids, you keep saying that over and over to them. And it's like, this is obviously going to be a trickle down in their regular academic life. They probably don't read very carefully either. And we all know the person where you send an email and they don't read it and the response doesn't acknowledge what you wrote. I always say parents are good indicators for how their child's going to read, because if they didn't read the email you sent them, your work is laid out for you with our student.
Probably unprofessional to say this, but sometimes when I'm like, okay, my schedule's full, I can work with one more kid, and parents all email me within a day or two of each other. Like sometimes I just first come, first serve, but when they're all pretty close, like sometimes I just look at the emails. I'm like, who seems like either the kid's going to be very coachable or just this is an easy parent to communicate with. Like sometimes that can be the decision maker, and when you have those big jumps, it's almost like when you have like the diet, the weight.
No, I say results are atypical.
Yeah, results are not typical.
That's right.
I tell lots of people
your results may vary.
Yeah.
Past performance, no indicator of future returns.
So, I mean, and with this, and so obviously it sounds like we have a similar idea here that the skills and the skills are important, but sometimes strategies are either all you need or it's all you have time for. And so that's always, you got to make the decision within that situation. I've recently sort of encountered this idea that maybe in certain ways, testing is driving what students are learning. Like I know that the College Board has a lot of interaction with universities across the country. And so they say, and I believe to them for the most part, that when they say revise the AP exams, like they did, like my English test, the AP language just revised this past year, that a lot of that comes out of talking to universities and professors. What are students doing? What do students need to do? What skills should we or shouldn't we emphasize? And then they say that they're designing the test around that. But I've also heard recently people saying that essentially whatever is on that test in certain ways steers what a lot of middle schools and high schools will teach or focus on because they want their students to score well and go. So to what extent, like, how do you see the relationship between, say, ACT or College Board and the things that students are learning in school?
I wish they changed. All right. I've been on a 10-year campaign to tell schools, if you want your students to get better test scores, SAT, ACT, across the board, spend a little time on grammar in English. And they don't. They won't. So no, I think that the SAT and ACT are aligned with Common Core, which comes from a place, outside the testing authorities, and what colleges value. And one of the reasons these tests exist is because they are evaluating skills that aren't necessarily the priorities in your everyday classroom. Now, the APs are different and state tests are different. In New York, we have the regents, and absolutely a teacher would be foolish to ignore APs or regents in choosing curriculum. But if we're talking about the general SAT or ACT, I would love to see more alignment. I just spent 2 weeks going through ACE training, which is ACT Certified Educator Training. And I was thrilled to be in classes with teachers from high schools all over the country trying to learn how to integrate more of this. When you think about it, Ryan, and I have a little bit of a bias here, I imagine that an organization that's been working on certain standards for 60 or 100 years has more to say of value than a teacher who's been teaching for 2 years or 4 years and is free to make up his or her own assessments, set her own standards. There's a middle ground, but I see the tests as resources that are kind of surfacing tried and true academic skills that benefit students.
Amy, is that your experience?
Yeah, I totally agree. The thing for me is, and this is why I kind of obviously, get irate about people railing against the test, is because on the ground, when you're working with a student and you can see very clearly what they know and what they don't know, to me, I'm not going to argue that knowing how to use a colon is the determiner for how smart your student is, but I can only say that if your student doesn't know how to use a colon, and I know the test teaches it, I'm going to do my best to make sure you understand how to use it. And so for me, a lot of it, what I find, and this is kind of going back to part of what your question was before, is a lot of what they have to know for the test was taught in 5th grade, 6th grade. So the hard part is, I think, we're judging sometimes high school teachers for the results of these tests when the groundwork for the skills were actually being laid way, way back when, and many kids will say to me, I've never had a high school teacher who's taught me about punctuation. And that's no judgment on high school teachers.
It should be. It should be. You should be doing this.
But what I'm saying is most, at least curriculum I've seen for high school teachers it's reading based, it's writing based. Now, obviously writing, if you go backwards, it's like, well, then that's writing. But the idea of the function of punctuation, the function of grammar, being able to identify what's a subject and a verb. I'm not going to lie, 90% of kids I work with couldn't pick out a verb to save their life. And so now, again, does that make them smart or not? That's for other people to decide. But the test is going to say, if you don't know that and you can't correct that, if you can't make that correction, the score is going to be a reflection of that. And so for me, my biggest takeaway is more the retention of information is at an all-time low. I don't remember observing that as much or being as upset about that as much earlier in my career as I am now. Students, I find it's very difficult for them to remember something from one week to the next, and I track that in my tutoring. I don't know about you, Mike. Do you think of retention as being an issue?
Well, as far as retention of apostrophe rules, absolutely. That seems to be a particular burden for students. And what's great about the SAT and ACT, and believe me, I'm not defending the SAT or ACT as superior to other tests, but what is interesting about them is that they are very skills-based. They are not so much retention-based. It's a far cry. I can do very well on an SAT or ACT. I don't want to take an AP bio test. I don't want to have to memorize all that detailed technical information, but give me a chance to show off my understanding of some fundamentals of reading or grammar or problem solving. I'm good to go.
Yeah, and I used to be down on the tests. I think as a student, I was not a big fan. just because I didn't want to take them. I did okay. I just didn't want to take it. And then when I started out teaching, I just saw it as like an extra hurdle. It was just an extra hoop to jump through, an inconvenience for students. It's, there's a lot of inequity in terms of results, or, as you pointed out, when you work the kid on the skills one-on-one, you can do all this work, but then it's who has the time or the money to be able to do that. And so, but I've recently, in the last few years, warmed to the tests a little bit, but it's not because I actually like the tests more. It's just because I have, I think, less confidence in what's happening in a lot of classrooms. And I don't mean to be like rude to other teachers about it, but grade inflation is rampant. When the most common grade given in a high school is a B+ or an A-, there's no way to tell. And I'm not trying to say that, well, hey, this kid got the B and that kid got the A, and so that kid deserves more later in their life. Like how you did in your junior English class should have relatively little impact on the rest of your life. Like we don't need to hold you to that forever. That being said, we do need to have some standard to achieve, or some way to compare when we're thinking about college admissions. You only have so many seats, you only have so many spots in the dorms, and I just don't feel like I trust the grades I see coming from a lot of schools and a lot of teachers. And so all of a sudden I find myself saying that the standardized tests are important in ways that just a few years ago I probably never would have. But it's not because I actually feel better about the tests. It's just because I feel like I can trust everything else less. And it's a weird evolution. And again, I've been teaching for 14, 15 years, and I've been doing tutoring on and off for 8. I've probably only more recently been paying as close attention as I do now. And so my feelings are very sort of strange in saying now I think the tests are way more important than I ever would have been comfortable saying it before. First, is that fair? But I mean, do you think that admissions are changing because of that? As you're thinking about test prep and helping students prepare for their admissions, is the admissions equation different because we're seeing all the grades in so many places creep up? Does the test mean
my
more?
comment is, I think, we can all appreciate, I think the test scores are the messenger. And I think what is the notion that kill the messenger? I think that's the problem, is that why we can all be, the ire against testing is because what the messenger may be telling you is not something you want to hear. I mean, no parent wants to know that if maybe they put their kid in a good school district, that somehow at the end of that their child somehow didn't get the learning, right? And so in that sense, if the tests are representing what are the standards for learning, what are the expectations we have for their academic capabilities, the tests are saying, well, then they're not measuring up to the standards that have been set. So as far as like in the admissions role, I grade inflation, I think is huge, which is why I think we can be even more upset about the tests, because they're kind of shining this even brighter light on something that we want to think, if my student has a 4.0, shouldn't I as a parent or teacher or counselor feel like they're in really good shape? And then they take a test and it may demonstrate something or speak to something that like, oh, maybe that's not, where they really are academically.
So, Ryan, when I hear you describing your evolution in how you perceive the tests, I hear the voice of experience. And everybody comes out thinking, the tests are not fair. I shouldn't be tested. I'm not a tree climber. Why should I be tested on how I climb trees? Nobody likes to be put in that box. And teachers, a lot of educators instinctively recoil against external assessment of what they're doing that's tangential to their priorities, meaning that as a school teacher, your goal is not to help a student get a better score on the SAT or ACT. However, whatever you're doing as a teacher should fit into a larger continuum of standards and goals for a student's future. And grade inflation is mathematically increasing. Amy and I, a while back, we interviewed Seth Gershenson, and he's a researcher with the Fordham Institute, and they conducted a long-term study, 2005 to 2016, of grade inflation. Not only is grade inflation rampant, but this may come as no surprise to you, it is more rampant in affluent schools and districts. And that means that grade inflation is not only creeping, but it is not a rising tide that lifts all boats. So when Amy talks about killing the messenger, like if we can't trust school data to tell us about evaluations outside the school environment, meaning class rank within a school is relevant, but it doesn't say anything about how a student in one school compares to another school or whether either of those students meet state standards. For that, you need more objective assessments that are designed to evaluate whatever it is that you wanted at that particular level, whether it's the state level or the national level, or you are in charge of a college and you know that students need to know so much. They need to be capable of so much in order to thrive in your environment. If you can't trust grades, what can you trust?
Yeah, and I mean, the idea there that you had that, it's going on more maybe in affluent schools, that's generally where I teach. I mean, I work in Loudoun County, Virginia, which by median household income is the wealthiest county in the country. Now, if you actually did total household wealth, we would be there. It's very much like a new money, a lot of government contractors and things, but the incomes on average are very high, which means that people pay for tutoring and there's a lot of resources. The schools are generally in good shape and all that kind of stuff. But I also think that those parents, either because they have their own education, a quality education, or they sort of know how school works, or they have the confidence that is necessary to call the school or write that teacher an email. I really do believe that on average, a lot of the worst teachers give the best grades because it just keeps everybody off your back.
Absolutely. Or the principal, the teacher wants to hold a line, but because those parents are such effective advocates, they go to the principal and the principal says, listen,
hey, what are you going to do? Yeah. I've had that conversation. Yeah. I've had that conversation with my principal, who is fantastic, several times. But one of the things he did the first or second year that he started at our school, and he was actually like the principal of the principals. He was the head of high school education and sort of came back into the building. And he said, we need to talk about grades and we need to talk about our, state standardized SOL tests and all this. And so he gave, just in the department, he gave the average grade and the grade distributions of all the grades each teacher gave and what the average and median were. And it was just a chart. And he said, you figure it out, talk about it, do whatever you need to do during a department meeting. And I've always had kids say, you're a tough grader, at least on the writing. And I'm like, you guys are just whining. Like, I'm not falling for it. And then I looked and I was like, oh my gosh, like, I'm the hardest grader in this department by like 4 or 5%, at which point I think I'm like, wow, I can't do anything to ask anyone else to raise their standards. So I need to find a way to keep grading and writing the way I do because my kids make huge improvements. But I need to build in some other fluff stuff in there. So at the end of the quarter, the grade goes up, even though I didn't give a better grade on that actual writing assignment because that's feedback. Like they need to get that. And I've had the conversation with the principal multiple times. Like, should I just give better grades? I mean, I tell them like, look, we'd all save a lot of time on emails and shred. Like, buddy, I would be happy not to grade that paper and give it a B+. Like, I just don't think it's the right thing to do. And he said, he told me, he said, just keep doing what you're doing. You're doing the right thing. He's put his kids into my classes. So like, I know he has confidence in it, but I think it's tricky. And that's where, when the test offers that standard sort of measure for whatever flaws may be included in it, it is standard across the board. And so while I do think we could do things to test better or offer some variety in the testing, in certain ways, that I don't know if that's the top priority. As you said, that's like, I want a better messenger, but maybe we need to figure out the message first. There's a lot of problems in how we prepare students. And then when we see test scores, I remember we had a teacher who gave almost all A's, high B's, and then, like a quarter of her, I don't want to say a quarter, I don't know what the numbers were, but a noticeable chunk of her students scored very low in the state test. Like they passed, but just barely kind of deal. And it's like, how do you have an A+ in your English class, but pass with the minimum score to pass, on the state test?
And did that teacher think she was doing her kids favors?
Probably. I don't know. The psychology of it's tricky.
What's interesting too about being an English teacher, in grading papers is, as you know, if you're going to do your job, you're going to be, it's a lot of work to grade a paper and make sure you're alerting the student to all the errors or whatever. And so the trickiest part, I can imagine, if I'm grading papers, it's an easier gig to sort of not be as critical as I can be, so I know some teachers take grading papers very seriously and very critically, and others it's like, okay, I circled a couple things and here's your grade. And
check, circle 2 misspelled words, and then at the bottom right, strengthen your thesis and elaborate on your evidence. And that applies to every essay ever written. So.
Yeah, and especially because sometimes I'll read students' writing. I don't have to read it very much, but when I do, and I'll think, I don't even know where to start here with that sentence. So I best just ignore the sentence because I can't even, like, moving words around and organizing ideas, sometimes that's even more complicated to try.
Yeah. So real quick, because I know we have a little bit of a time limit here, and I do want to, we've sort of moved into the bridge between the testing and what's actually happening in the classrooms. And so something that I like to ask everyone on the podcast is, what would be your ideal school? So if you had a budget, but you could essentially create whatever facilities or kind of staff you want, what do you think would be the ideal school?
Well, definitely more reading and writing. I mean, without question, I think reading more, writing more, there's no question it makes a better student, and I mean, honestly, being able to pay teachers and reward teachers more for the type of work they do. I mean, but what's tricky for a teacher, and I think you mentioned earlier in schools, is this notion of the accountability, like a test score, how it makes them have to be accountable. And I always tell parents, I'm very generous in how I speak of teachers, because at the end of the day, it's the student oftentimes who's got to do the work. And if they don't do the work, is that always a reflection on the job the teacher did? So to me, rewarding teachers better, more reading, more writing, more diverse reading, I would say those are certainly the things I'd be looking for if I were creating my own school.
Okay. Mike?
My formative education was not college. It was actually high school. I had the privilege of going to a special Jesuit school in Manhattan, Upper East Side, which drew academically advanced students from all 5 boroughs and, every place else in the tri-state area. And it was a stimulating learning environment in that I was in small classes. We had a graduating class of 125 people with the same academic ambition, roughly the same levels, and the teachers were able to really engage us in different areas. Not to say that we all liked science equally or we all liked history equally, but the standards were sufficient to keep us engaged. And that's a big thing, is we want school that doesn't bore students. So I would go with a high school. I think that Amy alluded to the challenges in the lower grades, not getting the right foundation, but I feel that high school is a perfect place to take students, and if you can group students small enough, you can really tailor all your different strands of learning and prepare for life outside of school, whatever that pathway is, whether it's to 4-year degrees, 2-year degrees, technical. I would like to see more hands-on work. I'd like to see more of an emphasis on core reading, communication, and problem solving, to the point where you can even slow down some of the more technical stuff. You might not have to do a full year of chemistry for all students. You might not have to do a full year of biology for all students, but you'd want to do more scientific understanding and the ability to evaluate data. You might not have to take kids into pre-calculus, but you should definitely do a lot of mathematical thinking and real problem solving. There are ways to prepare students, especially as they start to find who they are. You don't want to take kids off tracks that they want to hop on necessarily, but you also don't want to force kids down tracks just hoping, if I feed the student enough science, maybe by the time he's done with physics, he'll really be into science. We lose a lot of kids along the way for all of these tracks. So smaller groups, more broader skills, more opportunities, and if I'm really getting crazy, more peer teaching. You can have seniors as part of their work teaching freshmen and learning a lot through that process as well.
That's great. Yeah. And I think there's a lot to be said for depth over breadth, or at least the critical thinking, and sort of if you have the skills. I say if you have good literacy, numeracy, and a little bit of rhetoric, you can teach yourself anything else in the world. And so
that's a great motto, Ryan.
Yeah.
Take that.
We do everything we can to get kids into calculus. And then you think, how many people actually use calculus? I have all these kids who are in calculus that I can't even imagine what they're doing in their math class. And then I hand back essays and they can't figure out simple percentages. Like they all grab a calculator and I'm like, I know if I asked you to do it, you could do it. But the fact that your first reflex was not to just think of the numbers and do it, I think is a bigger problem. They're way better at math than I am, But for simple stuff, like if we went golfing, I could add up a squarecard quicker and more accurately.
Well, yeah.
than they
So why
can.
do you say they're
So,
better
like,
at math than you if you actually can do functional math better than them?
And that's why I'm agreeing with you in terms of sort of, we don't necessarily need to propel you to the ends of the subjects. We're not trying to create college professors, but maybe we need to get you the thinking and the functional skills so that you can get there if you want to. But yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. And I think that speaks to maybe some of the problems we do see in schools today. All right, so I've got a last question, and I'll give you guys a little open mic at the end if we have time, if there's anything you want to clarify or address that we skipped. But I do always ask people for a couple of books or movies that you would recommend, and this could be personal enjoyment, just your own favorites, things you like, or they could be things that you think have a positive impact on a community or might relate to testing or college admissions. Just whatever you like, what books or movies do you think people should check out?
Author-wise, I love Malcolm Gladwell. He's one of my favorite people to read. Always fascinating, but I will say mostly nonfiction. I'm a big nonfiction reader. I find it's easier to read, to pick up and drop, come back and forth to nonfiction, less fiction these days. Movies, wow. And boy, it's been a while since, right? I've been in a theater. Actually, one of the funniest movies that I still always love is Groundhog Day. And I actually reference it with my students because I always feel like my life is like Groundhog Day. If you're a test prep tutor and you're always working on the same tests, right? Every day sometimes feels like Groundhog Day because sometimes you're running through the same things with students. But that's one of my favorites.
So that's funny. Yeah, it's always the same leading into the test day. Like I've got to do this is the same things in this order. Yeah.
Amy, that makes me think of a new movie out by Andy Samberg, which is a Groundhog Day theme. I haven't seen it yet. Have you?
No, what is that?
I don't know the name of it, but now I'm going to look it up because it just came out. I think it was released on video. And I love Andy Samberg. Instead of giving a movie, I'll give a sitcom. Brooklyn Nine-Nine is definitely the freshest sitcom on today.
All right, nice.
And as far as books, one of my favorite authors who's extremely accessible and has insights that cut across all disciplines is Seth Godin. He's a marketing guru, but his books like The Dip, which talks about that point at which everybody has to consider whether they're going to quit or keep going and why quitting is often a good thing, would be so instructive to students on the path to college or people at any point in their lives. So Seth Godin's is really insightful and accessible because he writes small books centered around one idea that they just come off great. And I love books about performance. So one book I love is The Inner Game of Tennis. And I love it so much that Amy and I did a podcast on it, talking about the inner game of testing, the idea that so much of what we do is not about the technical skills, but what's going on between our ears. And again, highly relevant to any discipline.
Nice. Okay.
I don't play tennis. I've never played tennis in my life, but I love the book.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. That's one to check out. And I'm actually in agreement here. Obviously I was an English major and I always was into literature, and man, the last maybe 5 years, I read almost exclusively nonfiction. Like I go out of my way once in a while to work fiction in just to do it. So these are great. Yeah. And Seth Godin was actually recommended by, I think it was Megan O'Connor, who works at Kaplan.
We interviewed Megan.
Yeah. So
Kaplan.
Yeah, she was a big Seth. That was, I think, the only recommendation she gave. She rattled off a few things he wrote. I think that might have been it, maybe a movie with it. Just great. So before we wrap up, as we said when we were talking on your podcast, we could probably do this for a long time. So there's so much you can do. But in our time frame, is there anything you think that's important to address that we either missed or that deserves, extra attention, or maybe it was misrepresented? Is there anything you'd like to clarify before we wrap up?
So let me see if I got the wording right. With enough literacy, numeracy, and rhetoric, you can teach yourself anything.
I love that.
That's my belief. And that's also why I think that, it's good to take history and science. I love biology and all that. But for me, we could do a lot more choice in school, and not meaning like you have to take this class, but you get to choose your project. I think in high school, kids should be choosing their classes more like college, because as long as you can read and write and think and do some math, then all the rest of it is still at your disposal later on. You have the internet, you have a library. So, and in terms of test prep, when we were talking about those foundational skills, if a kid comes in and they have most of that,
they are good to go.
Yeah, our jobs get a whole lot easier, because that is a lot of what these tests focus on.
And our job becomes a whole lot more fun, right? Yeah. I mean, ultimately.
And so then let's be honest, right? The SAT and ACT are tests of literacy, numeracy, and rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that is one of the good things about them. That's why I'm, while I'd love to see some alterations, that's why I'm not prepared to toss them at all, because I think they are hitting on the most important things that we should be doing in school. So, all right, so we're going to wrap this up. We've been speaking with Mike Bergin, president of Chariot Learning, and Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros LLC. Again, they host the Tests and the Rest College Admissions Industry Podcast and are launching the National Test Prep Association, of which I may look into getting into, just because I think I have a lot more to learn, and you guys might be wonderful resources. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk and share your insights today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Ryan. This was fantastic.
Yeah.